They sowed the seeds as they had in countless seasons before, across the vast, sprawling fields of the Midwest. They waited for the rains to come on time, tending every acre with the hope of reaping a bountiful harvest. But when the corn, soybeans, and wheat were finally ready, the joy of harvest suddenly turned into emptiness. No contracts were signed, no trucks rushed in to collect the goods, no familiar checks arrived in the mail. Instead, a heavy silence blanketed the countryside. In less than 6 weeks, the storm of trade had slashed U.S. agricultural exports to China by nearly 28%. At the port of Oakland in California, once a bustling gateway where shipments of almonds, dairy, and beef flowed endlessly across the Pacific, cargo now sat piled up. Ships canceled routes and workers saw their hours cut. Containers stacked high like cold concrete blocks painted the picture of a massive trade system gasping for air. From the endless cornfields of Iowa to the warehouses lining the Pacific coast, the same fear loomed large. Production was higher than ever, but the biggest market had turned its back. This was not just the sting of a disappointing harvest, it was the mark of a silent crisis, rippling from farms to ports, from rural towns to urban centers. American farmers suddenly found themselves trapped in a cruel paradox, working harder, yet earning less, sowing hope, yet reaping despair. And behind that paradox was no natural disaster, but policy. This was not a fleeting disruption of supply and demand. It was the direct consequence of a trade confrontation. When Washington chose to escalate, Beijing did not sit idle. China, once a loyal customer of American crops, quickly charted a new course. And their calculated pivot, abandoning U.S. markets in favor of new allies in South America, cut the deepest wound into America's golden fields. China was once the #1 customer, the lifeline for millions of tons of American crops. Whenever ships left the ports, their final destinations were almost guaranteed: Shanghai, Tianjin, or Guangzhou. Nearly 90% of U.S. sorghum exports flowed into China, and for many years, American soybeans were the key ingredient sustaining the massive livestock industry of the world's most populous nation. Yet in just a short span, it all collapsed. A figure that once inspired pride, 1.4 million tons of sorghum, dwindled to a mere 78,000. A staggering 94% drop in just 2 months, like a door slamming shut in the darkness, leaving behind a breathless shock. This wasn't the randomness of the market or the whim of the weather. It was a calculated strike. Beijing slapped punitive tariffs as high as 125% on many U.S. agricultural products, turning them into overpriced luxuries that could no longer compete. But China didn't stop there. They accelerated long-term contracts with Brazil and Argentina, pouring massive investments into ports and railways, building an entirely new supply chain. Ships that once carried American soybeans now sailed with Brazilian harvests. Freight trains in South America rumbled non-stop to fill the void America left behind. That pivot was both economic and political. It sent a clear message: China would not bow to pressure. They turned dependence into an opportunity for liberation. Once these new trade channels were established, the old ties with the U.S. became expendable. In global trade, trust once lost is hard to regain, and when a giant market like China finds alternative suppliers, it has little reason to turn back. America, whether it liked it or not, had let go of the gold mine it once held. The irony deepened as China not only replaced the U.S. with one partner, but diversified its sources to minimize risk. Brazil rose to become the top supplier, Argentina reaped its share of benefits, and even Russia and some African nations began to step in. From a position of dominance, the U.S. found itself pushed to the sidelines. This loss was measured not just in trade figures, but in the erosion of Washington's geopolitical influence on the world's food map. And so, as American containers sat idle at the ports, as Iowa farms overflowed with unsold corn, a haunting question grew louder. What exactly had the government promised, and what had it delivered to the farmers? They had been told they would be the winners, that standing firm against China would bring bigger contracts and wider markets. Yet after all the promises, what they received was not new customers, but relief checks. And with that, the story turns to its next chapter, Washington and its unfinished promises. When the trade war began, speeches from Washington rang with confidence. Officials declared that American farmers would be the biggest winners, that all they needed was to endure for a short while, and China would be forced to yield. opening its markets and buying even more. The picture painted was one of overflowing fields, convoys of trucks hauling crops to the ports, and lucrative contracts pouring into every farm. But the reality was far different. What farmers received after their grueling seasons was not new contracts, but relief checks, fragile slips of paper that could never replace a lost market. The government spent tens of billions of dollars to offset the damage, but as one Iowa farmer bitterly put it, a check can't replace a market. The aid might help pay the utility bills, buy a little fuel, or carry them through the winter, but it could not restore trust from international buyers, and nor could it create long-term stability. For those whose lives are tied to the land, market stability is as essential as sun and rain. The irony deepened when even organizations once loyal to the administration began speaking out. The American Soybean Association, the National Farmers Union, and even the American Farm Bureau Federation, a conservative group rarely critical of the White House, all voiced discontent. They argued that the president's unchecked tariff powers were doing more harm than good, and that Congress needed a say in the matter. For the first time in decades, voices from the fields echoed into the halls of power, not as scattered complaints, but as a collective, systemic resistance. Within that resistance lay profound disappointment. Farmers had been promised that they would stand as pillars, as the pride of America in a global confrontation. Instead of becoming beneficiaries, they became silent victims, absorbing each retaliatory strike from China. And when the relief checks arrived, they were nothing more than painkillers, temporary relief for a chronic condition. But the story did not end with the farmers. As the market tightened, an entire supply chain began to stagger. From ports to factories, from dock workers to truck drivers, all felt the weight of the trade storm, and the consequences became most visible in places once alive with ship horns and the hum of cranes. America's ports, where silence was slowly replacing the rush of activity. From the vast fields of Iowa to the shores of California, the undercurrent of crisis spread like a chain reaction of cracks. When China shut the door on imports, it wasn't just the farmers who buckled under the weight. The entire logistics and supply chain behind them was dragged down as well. At the port of Oakland, once alive with lines of containers streaming in and out, the air had grown suffocating. Port Director Christy McKenna admitted that every container stuck, every ship canceled, wasn't just a statistic on paper. It meant jobs, livelihoods, the daily bread of thousands of families. Blank sailings, ships canceled at the last minute, became a familiar phrase. Each cancellation erased millions of dollars and left hundreds of workers temporarily unemployed. Dock workers had their hours cut, truck drivers lost their loads, cold storage facilities overflowed with crops that could no longer be shipped. In Washington state, the hay export industry, almost entirely dependent on Asian markets, was forced to slash its workforce by 25% in just 2 weeks. Wood pulp exporters saw more than 6,000 tons of goods sitting idle in warehouses, and in one case, a 9,000-ton shipment had to anchor offshore, unable to dock. The pressure didn't stop with those directly tied to agriculture. The domino effect spread to transport, insurance, even banking. Canceled contracts drove storage costs through the roof. Companies were crushed under rising loan interest. The dollars that once circulated with each shipment were now frozen, turning into burdens on the shoulders of small and medium-sized businesses. Meanwhile, large distribution corporations found ways to adapt and even exploit the situation, squeezing farmers by buying at rock-bottom prices while selling to consumers at a premium. American consumers, too, could not escape the spiral. As external supply tightened, domestic food prices climbed. Households paid on average 18% more for daily meals, from cartons of milk to cuts of meat to bottles of cooking oil. Bitterly ironic, the farmers, the very creators of wealth, took home less, while the middlemen reaped the gains. A policy once declared to protect farmers had turned into a burden on both them and society at large. The cost was measured not only in lost economic value, but also in social imbalance. In rural areas, family farms teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. In cities, unemployed dock workers and truckers faced a foggy future. And on the dinner tables of American households, price changes became a daily reminder of a trade war that seemed distant yet pressed into every bite of food. And as the entire nation strained under this weight, one question thundered louder. Why did Washington continue down this path? Was economic interest no longer at the center, replaced instead by political calculations, votes, elections, and grand geopolitical chess games? Here the story shifts to another dimension: political maneuvering and global consequences. In Washington's political arena, being tough on China was seen not just as an economic policy, but as a political weapon. It projected the image of a strong government, ready to defend national interests against a rising rival. Fiery speeches, sharp and provocative tweets, all were launched to cement a posture of no concessions. For a segment of voters, it inspired confidence that America was standing tall in an uneven fight. But on the global chessboard, the effect was entirely different. As the US built tariff walls, China did not retreat. Instead, it seized the chance to restructure its supply chains. It turned to Brazil, Argentina, and then expanded into Africa and Russia. The European Union, long a competitor of the US in agricultural exports, quickly stepped in to fill the gaps. Canada and Mexico, two key neighbors and trade partners, were also forced to respond with retaliatory tariffs. Inadvertently, America pushed itself outside the circle of trust, becoming an unreliable player in the eyes of both allies and rivals. The long-term consequences could prove more dangerous than the immediate deficits. Once a partner is deemed unstable, countries will diversify their suppliers rather than rely on one. Trust erodes, and global supply chains begin to form without the US at the center. This is a quiet but steady shift, one that could last years, even decades. And when the balance tilts away, America will find itself bargaining from a much weaker position. Yet while politicians in Washington weigh electoral gains, out in the heartland, American farmers bear the costs directly. They cannot wait for long-term results or geopolitical strategies. All they know is that each harvest has become a gamble, sowing seeds in anxiety, reaping losses instead of returns. And so, the story no longer rests on grand strategy, but forks into a painful crossroads on every field. Will American farmers keep planting only to lose or be forced to walk away? Across the sprawling fields of Iowa, farmers keep planting even though they know they will lose money. The irony is stark. They plant not to earn a profit, but to minimize their losses. If they stop farming, they'll lose their cash flow, their land, and quickly fall into bankruptcy. So they sow their seeds with no hope of profit, only the desperate wish to keep their family farms alive. In Kentucky, some farmers even consider leaving their crops unharvested because the costs of fuel, labor, and transportation exceed the market price of their produce. Fields of golden grain, once symbols of joy, now weigh heavily on their hearts. Each cut of the sickle feels like a cut into their wallets. Some family farms passed down through 3 or 4 generations are now declaring bankruptcy one after another. Family farm bankruptcies have risen more than 50% in just a year, a cold statistic hiding countless tearful stories. Some farmers have been forced to sell the tractors that carried them through a lifetime of work. Others mortgage their homes to pay mounting bank debts. Still others quietly put up for sale signs on ancestral land, leaving with a lump in their throats as they walk away from soil that had defined their identity. Meanwhile, large agribusiness corporations seize the moment to expand. They buy up land at bargain prices, grow their holdings, and tighten their grip on the market. With abundant capital, global distribution networks, and the ability to adapt quickly, they thrive where small farms collapse. The gap grows sharper. The small family farms, once the backbone of American agriculture, are vanishing, while giant corporations rise to dominate. Rural inequality deepens, and the cherished image of the free and independent American farmer fades into memory. This is not just an economic crisis, it is a crisis of spirit. American farmers, once proud of their resilience, now face a cruel question: keep planting and accept losses, or walk away and lose everything. Either path carries bitter consequences, for every road leads to loss. And in this fragile uncertainty, the image of an America once powerful on the global agricultural stage now appears fractured, with cracks that may never fully mend. The trade war, once painted as a shield to protect American farmers, has instead turned into a nightmare. Fields once heavy with grain now carry only anxiety. Markets have collapsed, contracts have vanished, prices have unraveled, while relief checks are little more than drops of water in a desert of thirst. The greatest pain lies not in a single failed harvest, but in the quiet, steady shift of global supply chains. China has turned to Brazil and Argentina. The European Union has broadened its sources. Canada and Mexico are no longer dependent. Once that central position is lost, America is forced back to the negotiating table from a weaker stance, and the road to rebuilding trust may take decades. From Iowa's farmlands to Oakland's ports, this is not just America's story. It is a reminder to the entire world. Global trade cannot be steered by short-term decisions. True strength does not lie in slogans, but in stability, trust, and long-term vision. When a nation chooses to wield tariffs as a political weapon, the cost is not only economic deficits, but the erosion of trust, something hard to build, yet so easy to lose. And in the end, across the vast Midwest fields, American farmers are sowing yet another season of uncertainty. Their story is a stark warning that every decision made by those in power leaves a lasting mark on human lives. What do you think? Are tariffs truly a way to protect, or are they a double-edged sword that ends up wounding the very people they were meant to defend? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue exploring in-depth analyses of the global shifts shaping our world today.